secrets buried for generations. In the inbred gorge of the Appalachians, those words are not a warning, they are a eulogy for three people who never had a chance to be anything other than what the mountains made them, what their own blood made them. This is not a story about monsters. This is a story about what happens when a family turns inward for so long that the outside world forgets it ever existed, and the inside world forgets what it means to be whole. This is the story of the Harlan Gorge, tucked so deep into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky that even the locals in the nearest town, a place called Belfry, would lower their voices when the name came up. Not out of fear, exactly, out of something older than fear, out of the particular discomfort that human beings feel when they are forced to confront a truth that no one wanted to name out loud. The truth was this: for at least 4 generations, possibly 5, a single family had lived in that gorge without ever bringing in a single new bloodline. No newcomers, no outsiders, only the same blood, turning and turning on itself like a river with nowhere left to go. And by the time the world finally looked into that gorge, by the time the story finally broke open like a wound that had been stitched shut for too long, 3 people remained. 3 people who carried in their bodies every secret that the Harlan Gorge had ever tried to bury. Their names were Elias, Marta, and Coyle. And this is their story. Not the story that people wanted to tell about them, the whispered, horrified version that circulated in diners and barbershops and county offices. This is the real story. The one that begins not with horror, but with loneliness. The one that begins not with shame, but with the quiet, devastating reality of people who were born into a world they did not choose, shaped by forces that had been set in motion long before any of them drew their first breath. The Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky are a place of extraordinary brutal beauty. The ridges rise and fall like something breathing, covered in hardwood forest that turns amber and copper in the fall, and dark green in the summer, and the hollows between those ridges hold their own weather, their own time, their own silences. It is a part of America that has always existed slightly outside of America, a region where the industrial economy arrived late and left early, where poverty carved itself into the landscape as surely as any river, where family ties were not just sentimental but structural, the architecture of survival in a place where survival was never guaranteed. It was in this context, this specific, irreplaceable, deeply human context, that the Harlan Gorge family came to be. The first records of the family date back to the late 1800s, when a man named Josiah Harlan filed a land claim on a parcel of property at the base of a narrow gorge that cut through one of the more remote ridges in Pike County. Josiah was, by all accounts, a man who wanted to be left alone. He had come from somewhere further east, some said Virginia, some said North Carolina, and he had arrived in the Kentucky mountains with a wife, a wagon, and a disposition toward solitude that bordered on hostility. He built a cabin. He grew a garden. He kept to himself. For a few years he was simply another homesteader in a region full of homesteaders, unremarkable except for his exceptional resistance to any form of neighborly contact. But then something shifted. His wife passed. His oldest son, rather than leaving to find work or a wife in one of the larger settlements, stayed. And when that son eventually had children of his own, those children stayed too. And so it began. Not with malice, not with intention, but with geography and grief and the slow, suffocating weight of isolation. The gorge itself contributed to the isolation in ways that are difficult to fully convey, unless you have stood at its entrance and looked up at the walls of rock and vegetation that rise on either side. The single path in and out of the Harlan Gorge was a narrow dirt track that flooded every spring and turned to mud that could swallow a truck axle every fall. There was no bridge over the creek that ran through the gorge's center until the 1960s, and even after the bridge was built, it was a one-lane wooden structure that rattled like a threat every time anything heavier than a pickup crossed it. The outside world was not forbidden in the Harlan Gorge. It was simply very, very far away in every sense that mattered. By the time the 20th century arrived, the family had already folded in on itself in ways that were beginning to leave marks. Not dramatic marks, not yet. Subtle ones. A child born with a slight asymmetry in the face, another with hearing that was not quite right. a pattern of miscarriages that the women of the family spoke of only among themselves, in low voices, as if speaking too loudly might make it worse. These were the early whispers of what geneticists call consanguinity, the biological reality of closely related individuals reproducing together, generation after generation, in a closed loop that progressively concentrates whatever genetic variations exist in that original bloodline, including the harmful ones. Human beings carry in their DNA a significant number of recessive genetic variants, mutations that, in a typical population, rarely cause problems because the odds of inheriting two copies of the same harmful variant from both parents are very low. But in a closed family system, those odds change dramatically. Each generation that reproduces within the family increases the probability that any given individual will inherit two copies of a harmful variant, one from each parent, and when that happens, the variant expresses itself. It becomes visible. It becomes physical. It becomes, in the most literal sense, written in the body. The family that lived in the Harlan Gorge by the mid-20th century was a family in which this process had been running, quietly and catastrophically, for generations. And the three people at the center of this story, Elias, Marta, and Coyle, were the ones in whom that process had run longest and deepest. Elias was the oldest of the three. He was born in 1951 in the same cabin where his father and his father's father had been born, delivered by his own grandmother, in the manner that had always been used in the Gorge because hospitals were for people who lived somewhere else. From the beginning, it was clear that Elias was different. His skull had not formed with typical symmetry. The left side of his face sat slightly lower than the right, giving him a quality of perpetual tilt, as if he were always listening to something just out of reach. His eyes were set close together, almost touching, a feature that became more pronounced as he grew older rather than less. His spine curved in a way that made standing fully upright difficult, so that he moved through the world in a permanent slight lean, like a tree that had grown toward a light that was never quite where it was supposed to be. His hands were large and powerful despite everything, and he used them constantly, for work, for building, for the kind of silent, exhausting physical labor that the Gorge demanded of everyone who lived in it. He was not a man who complained. He was not, in fact, a man who spoke very much at all. Language had always been difficult for Elias, not because he was unintelligent. Those who knew him understood that there was a sharp and observant mind behind those close-set eyes, but because something in the architecture of his mouth and jaw made certain sounds difficult to form, and the effort of forming them was, over time, not worth the result. He communicated mostly in gestures, in the economy of motion that people who live close together in isolated spaces develop. A tilt of the chin that meant yes, a particular stillness that meant no, a way of pausing near a problem that meant he had seen it and was thinking about it. He was, by every account of those who encountered him, a man who had adapted himself to the world he had been given, with a kind of stoic, unspectacular courage that nobody ever named as courage, because there was no one there to name it. Marta was younger than Elias by 4 years, born in 1955, and she was in the taxonomy of the Gorge, his closest relative in the generation they shared, a relationship so tangled by multiple generations of consanguinity that defining it precisely would require a genealogical chart of considerable complexity. What mattered in the Gorge was simply that they were family. That word covered everything. Marta's physical presentation was different from her brother's, if brother is the right word, and in the Gorge it was always the word that was used, regardless of the exact biological reality. Where Elias's differences were in his structure, in the architecture of bone and spine, Marta's were primarily in her face and her hands. Her face was broad across the cheekbones and narrow at the chin in a way that gave it a triangular quality, and her eyes, like Elias's, were set unusually close together, but they were also slightly different in size, the left noticeably larger than the right, and this asymmetry gave her expressions a quality of unreadability, a sense that whatever she was feeling existed in two registers at once. Her hands were her most striking feature. The fingers on both hands were fused in pairs, a condition called syndactyly, which meant that she had learned to do everything: cooking, cleaning, sewing, the 1,000 daily tasks that kept a household running in a place with no modern conveniences. with hands that most people would have considered disabling. She had not considered them disabling, she had considered them hands. The adaptation was so complete, so natural, so simply part of who she was, that watching her work was less striking than it sounds in description. She moved through her kitchen, a low-ceilinged room with a wood-burning stove and shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables and dried herbs, with the authority of someone who had mastered their environment absolutely. She was the one who kept things running. She was the one who remembered where things were, who tracked the seasons, who knew when the creek was going to flood based on the color of the sky 2 days before. If Elias was the physical force of the household, Marta was its memory and its will. Coyle was the youngest of the three, born in 1963, and his story is the most difficult to tell, not because it is more painful than the others, though in some ways it is, but because Coyle existed in a state that is hardest to convey without either sensationalizing or diminishing. He was, in the clinical language of the outside world, severely affected by the accumulated genetic consequences of the family's long isolation. His body was small and compacted, bent in several places by skeletal conditions that had gone undiagnosed and untreated, and his face bore the most complex constellation of differences of the three, features that reflected layers of genetic expression so interwoven that no single cause could be named. But Coyle was also, and this is the part that the outside world consistently failed to understand or to credit, a person of extraordinary emotional sensitivity. He could not read. He had never been taught. He could not do the kind of practical physical work that Elias did, but he could hear music from a long way off. There was a radio in the Gorge, battery-powered, and Coyle could identify any song within the first 3 notes, and he could sense the emotional temperature of any room he entered, with an accuracy that bordered on the uncanny. He knew when Marta was worried before she said anything. He knew when Elias was in pain before the older man changed his posture. He responded to these things not with words but with action, moving closer, sitting beside, placing one of his bent hands on a forearm in a gesture of such simple, unadorned comfort that it silenced the room. He was, in a household that had very little of anything, the one who gave comfort. The three of them had been living alone in the Gorge since the mid-1980s, when the last of the older generation died, an event that passed without any official notice, because the older generation had also passed without any official notice for most of their lives. There was no death certificate. There was a grave, dug by Elias in the plot behind the cabin where generations of the family had been buried, and there was a marker, a piece of flat stone with nothing written on it, because Elias could not write and did not think that a name was necessary. The dead knew who they were. That was the philosophy of the Gorge. After that, the three of them were alone. Alone in a way that is difficult to conceptualize from outside that particular geography and that particular life. There was no phone. The road in and out of the Gorge had not been maintained by the county in years, and the bridge, the wooden one-lane bridge, had developed a crack in one of its main supports that made crossing it uncertain at best. They grew most of what they ate. They had a small herd of goats, some chickens, a garden that Marta managed with the same absolute authority with which she managed everything else. They did not go to town. Town had never been kind to them, in the particular casual way that towns are sometimes unkind to people who are visibly different. The stares, the silence that falls when you walk into a store, the children who point and then are hushed by parents who are themselves staring. Elias had made the calculation at some point in his 40s that the things town could provide were not worth what town cost, and so they stayed. The seasons moved through the Gorge as they always had. Spring brought floods, and then the violent, almost violent green of new leaves. Summer was heavy and close, the air thick with humidity and the sound of insects. Fall stripped the trees down to their bones and filled the sky with that particular high-altitude blue that feels like the world holding its breath. Winter locked the Gorge in silence so complete that Coyle, who was afraid of almost nothing, would sometimes climb into the small loft space above the main room just to feel the pressure of the low ceiling above him, some animal instinct for enclosure reasserting itself against the vast, indifferent quiet outside. They had a routine. Routines were the architecture of their days, the way that structure kept the formlessness of isolation at bay. Elias rose first before light and went out to check on the animals and assess the state of the property, the fences, the garden, the condition of the path. Marta made breakfast on the wood stove, eggs when the chickens were laying, cornbread from the meal they ground themselves, coffee that was more chicory than coffee but that was hot and bitter and welcome. Coyle slept later than the other two and woke with a particular enthusiasm that had never diminished, a genuine, unreserved pleasure in the fact of a new day that the others had lost, if they had ever had it, but that they had come to depend on in the way you depend on something you did not know you needed, until it was there. He would come down from the loft with his bent, careful movements and stand in the kitchen doorway and look at Marta at the stove and make a sound that was not quite a word, but was clearly, unmistakably, "Good morning." And Marta would answer without turning around, because she always knew he was there before she heard him, and the day would begin. It was this life, small, contained, sufficient in its own terms, that the outside world interrupted in the spring of 1998. The interruption came in the form of a county social worker named Patricia Wills, who had been assigned to investigate a report that had come in from a postal worker who occasionally tried to deliver mail to the Gorge, and who had, on his most recent attempt, seen Coyle near the road and had been alarmed enough by what he saw to file a report. The report was vague. The postal worker was not a medical professional and did not have the vocabulary for what he had observed, but it was enough to send Patricia Wills down the flooded road to the Harlan Gorge on a grey April morning, her county vehicle bottoming out twice on the way in, her mind full of protocols and procedures and the particular emotional armour that people in her profession learn to wear. What she found was not what she expected. She had expected, she admitted this later in the account she wrote of her experience, something that matched the horror of the report. What she found instead was a household. A functioning, organized, dignified household in which 3 adults were living their lives with the same mix of effort and habit and small pleasure that any 3 people living together develop over years of shared routine. The cabin was clean, the garden was prepared for spring planting, there was food, there was order. There was, evident in the way the 3 moved around each other and communicated in their private, wordless language, something that she could only describe as care. She sat at Marta's kitchen table. She was invited to sit, offered coffee, the fused hands of the woman across from her moving around the kitchen with that absolute, practiced authority. And she tried to do her job. She asked questions. Marta answered them, in the slow and careful English of someone who has not had much occasion to speak it, but has not forgotten how. She explained their situation plainly and without defensiveness. They lived here. They had always lived here. They managed. They did not need anything from the county. Thank you for coming. The road is bad on the way out. Be careful of the soft shoulder near the second bend. Delia stood in the doorway of the kitchen for most of the visit, not threateningly, just present, in the way that he was always present when something was happening that concerned his household. He did not speak. He watched. Coyle did not come downstairs during the visit. Patricia Wills heard him moving in the loft above and looked up once, and Marta said simply, "He is resting," and Patricia Wills did not push it. She left with more questions than she had arrived with, and with a feeling that she struggled to name for years afterward. It was not pity, exactly. It was not horror. It was something closer to grief, a grief for the distance between the world these 3 people inhabited, and the world that might have been possible for them if history had run differently, if the gorge had been less deep and the road less broken and the blood less turned upon itself. She filed her report. The report triggered a referral. The referral triggered a visit from a medical team from the University of Kentucky, which had a program that worked with rural and isolated communities. The medical team spent 2 days in the gorge in the late summer of 1998. They brought a doctor, a genetic counselor, and a social work supervisor. They were, by all accounts, professional and respectful. They were also, by all accounts, shaken by what they found, not by the poverty which they had seen before, and not by the isolation which they had also seen before, but by the depth of the genetic expression they were observing in the 3 individuals, and by the clarity with which those 3 individuals illustrated what happens when consanguinity runs unchecked for multiple generations without any intervention, medical or social or otherwise. The report that the medical team produced was a document of considerable technical complexity. It identified, in Elias, a combination of skeletal and cranial abnormalities consistent with the expression of multiple recessive genetic variants. Variants that, in a typical population, would rarely, if ever, have found expression because the probability of inheriting two copies from unrelated parents was vanishingly small. In Marta, the same principle applied to her syndactyly and the facial asymmetry, and a set of immune deficiencies that had left her vulnerable to infections that her body had, somehow, managed to fight off throughout her life, at a cost that was written in her face in a different way than her other differences were. In Coyle, the report was the longest and most complex, reflecting the greatest accumulation of expressed variants and the most significant impact on development and physical structure. The report was thorough. It was also, in its thoroughness, deeply, inescapably sad. Because what the report was documenting, in its clinical language, behind its tables and its genetic terminology and its carefully hedged conclusions, was not simply a medical phenomenon. It was the accumulated cost of generations of loneliness. It was what happens when a family is so cut off from the world that it has no choice but to turn to itself, over and over, until the turning becomes the only thing it knows. The medical team offered services. They offered transportation to a specialist in Lexington who could address some of Coyle's more pressing physical needs. They offered a home health aide. They offered a monthly supply of medications that would help with several of the chronic pain issues that all three of the residents of the Gorge were managing on their own, with the herbal knowledge that Marta had accumulated over a lifetime, and with the kind of stoic endurance that was, in that place, simply the condition of being alive. Elias listened to all of this and then tilted his chin slightly in the direction of the door. It was the gesture that meant no. Patricia Wills, who was present for this meeting, watched Marta for her reaction. Marta was looking at Elias. Something passed between them. Some long, loaded communication in the language they shared, the language that had no words, because words had never been necessary between them. And then Marta turned back to the medical team and said, in her careful, slow English, that she appreciated their coming, that she would think about the medications, that Coyle was not going to Lexington. She said the last part without apology and without particular emotion, simply as a fact. Coyle was not going to Lexington. The reason that Marta gave later to Patricia Wills, in a conversation that Patricia Wills carried with her for the rest of her career, was not the reason that most people would have expected. It was not distrust of the medical establishment, though that distrust existed and was not unreasonable given the history of the region. It was not stubbornness, though there was stubbornness too. It was something simpler and more devastating than either of those things. Marta said, "Coyle has never left this gorge. If he leaves this gorge, it will be the first time he has ever not known where he is. And he won't know what the faces mean, the faces of people who look at him and don't know how to hide what they're feeling. He knows our faces. He knows what our faces mean. I am not sending him somewhere where the faces are wrong. Leave a comment if that hit you. Write it below. Do not scroll past this without writing something, because what Marta said in that moment is one of the most human things that anyone has ever said in the presence of someone taking notes, and it deserves to be witnessed by everyone who hears it. She was not wrong. The gorge was not a good place, not in the way that comfortable places are good, not in the way that well-resourced and connected and medically attended places are good, but it was the only place that Coyle had. It was the only place where his particular way of moving through the world, his emotional acuity, his attachment to routine, his morning sounds of greeting, and his late-night fear of silence, was known and accommodated and met without flinching. The outside world, whatever it could offer materially, could not offer that. And Marta knew it. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui você encontra histórias que o YouTube esconde dos outros. Narrativas reais, pesadas, que ninguém mais tem coragem de contar do jeito que elas merecem ser contadas. Se inscreva agora antes de continuar. The years after the 1998 visits were years of slow incremental change, not transformation, nothing as dramatic as that, but the kind of quiet adjustment that happens when two worlds that have been completely separate are forced into occasional contact. The medications that the medical team had offered were after some months accepted. Marta had thought about them, as she said she would, and had concluded that the benefit was real and the risk was acceptable. A county nurse named Donna Fields began making monthly visits to the Gorge, coming down the bad road in her truck, bringing the medications and checking on the 3 residents with a matter-of-factness that Elias eventually stopped interpreting as threat. Donna Fields was a woman of few unnecessary words which helped. She did not stare. She did not change her expression when she was looking at Coyle. She brought things they needed and asked practical questions and drank Marta's chicory coffee and said goodbye and left. She was, in the taxonomy of the Gorge, acceptable. During this period, Elias's health began to decline. The skeletal issues that had been part of his structure since birth were, in his late 40s, compounding in ways that made the physical labor he had always performed increasingly difficult. The curvature of his spine was worsening, slowly but measurably, in a way that Donna Fields noted in her visits with the careful neutrality of someone who is watching something that cannot be stopped and is doing her best to slow it. He adapted, as he had always adapted, rearranging the way he worked, finding angles and positions and sequences of movement that compensated for what his body could no longer do. But the adaptation had limits, and over the years of that decade those limits became visible. He moved more slowly. He rested more. He sat in the chair by the window in the evenings, with a stillness that was different from the stillness of a man at peace, and more like the stillness of a man managing something. Marta watched this and said nothing about it and did more. She took on more of the physical work, the hauling, the maintenance, the outdoor labor that had been Elias's domain. Her fused hands, which had never been a limitation in her own understanding of herself, were a genuine limitation in this kind of work, and the workarounds she developed were ingenious and costly in the way that workarounds always are, in the hidden currency of effort and time and strain. Coyle, who sensed all of this, responded with the behavioral changes that were his way of responding to change. He became more present, more attentive, more insistent in his gestures of proximity and comfort. He sat closer to Elias in the evenings. He followed Marta into the garden and stayed near her when she worked, not helping in any practical sense, he could not, but being there, which was its own kind of help. The 3 of them moved through that period as they moved through everything, together, in the wordless and practiced language of people who have shared space and history so completely that the boundaries between them are more suggested than real. It was in the summer of 2003 that the first journalist came to the Gorge. He was a young man from a paper in Lexington, working on a feature about isolated communities in eastern Kentucky, and he had gotten the lead from someone in the county social services office who should not have given it to him, and who likely regretted it later. He drove down the road in a rental car and got it stuck in the mud at the bottom of the incline before the bridge, and had to walk the last quarter mile, arriving at the cabin with mud on his shoes and a recorder in his hand, and the particular brightness in his eyes that young journalists get when they think they are about to get the story that will make them. He was not invited in. Elias met him at the gate, the wooden gate at the edge of the property, the one that had always marked the boundary between the Gorge and the world, and stood there, tilted slightly, with that quality of permanent listening, and did not move aside. The journalist tried several approaches. He explained what he was doing. He said he wanted to tell their story, to let people understand their lives. He said he had the right to be there, which was technically true, but also exactly the wrong thing to say to a man who had spent his entire life watching his family disappear inside a geography that the world had forgotten. Elias did not speak. He stood at the gate. Eventually the journalist left. He wrote the story anyway, from what he had gathered from county records and the brief accounts of people in Belfry who had heard things over the years. It ran in the Lexington paper and was picked up by a wire service and ran in several other places. And for a few weeks the Harlan Gorge family was briefly, unwantedly famous, the subject of op-eds about rural poverty and genetic isolation, and the failures of social services and the obligations of government to people who fall through every available net. The 3 people in the Gorge did not know about any of this. They did not have a television. The radio received music and weather and not much else. The world that was talking about them was a world they had never lived in, and its opinion of them, however well-intentioned some of it was as irrelevant to the actual texture of their days as the opinion of the moon. But the story had consequences even without their knowledge. It brought more attention from the county. It brought a visit from a state-level official who was genuinely concerned about the situation and who pushed for more consistent support services. It also brought eventually a historian named Dr. Carol Ashton from Eastern Kentucky University, who had spent 20 years studying the isolated communities of the Appalachian region, and who was, from the first moment she set foot in the gorge, different from everyone else who had come before her. She was different in one specific and crucial way. She was not there to help. She was not there to fix anything or document anything in the clinical or journalistic sense. She was there, as she explained to Marta, who met her at the gate since Elias had taught her that lesson, to understand. Not to understand the genetics or the poverty or the policy failures, to understand the people. She brought no recorder. She brought no official documents. She came several times over the course of 2 years, each time sitting at Marta's kitchen table with a cup of chicory coffee and a quality of attention that Marta later told Donna Fields she had never experienced from anyone outside the gorge. Dr. Ashton listened. She asked questions that were not looking for answers that confirmed what she already knew. She was genuinely curious, in the way that genuine curiosity is recognizable. It creates a different quality of silence in a room, a different feeling of being heard rather than observed. Over those 2 years, Marta talked more to Dr. Ashton than she had talked to any outside person in her entire life. She talked about the gorge, its seasons, its particular qualities of light, the way the creek smelled in spring, and the way the frost came in patterns on the windows in January. She talked about her garden, about the years of experiment and adjustment that had given her the knowledge to grow food in a specific, difficult microclimate. She talked about Elias, carefully and without detail, in a way that communicated his reality without exposing it. She talked about Coyle, also carefully, also with love, in a way that was clear about what his life was, and also clear that his life was a life, not a case study, not a tragedy, not an illustration of anything except itself. She did not talk about the genetics. She did not talk about the family structure in the way that people wanted to talk about it. She talked about what it felt like to wake up in the gorge in the morning. She talked about what it felt like to watch the seasons turn in a place that you had never once left. She talked about the particular quality of knowing someone so completely that their absence, when you imagined it, was not the absence of a person, but the absence of a whole world. Dr. Ashton's eventual work, an academic paper and then a small book published by the university press, treated the gorge and its inhabitants with a care and specificity that was, in the context of everything else written about them, rare enough to be almost remarkable. She did not use their real names. She did not include photographs. She described what she had seen and heard in a way that maintained the dignity of the people she was describing, while being honest about the conditions of their lives. The book was not widely read outside of academic circles, but it was the truest account that existed. By 2007, Elias's health had deteriorated to the point where he rarely left the cabin. The progression of the skeletal issues had reached a stage where standing was painful, and walking more than a short distance was, on most days, not possible. He sat in his chair by the window and watched the gorge the way he had always watched everything, with that quality of attention that saw everything and commented on nothing. Marta managed the external work almost entirely on her own now. Coyle stayed close to Elias, a constant and gentle presence, sitting on the floor beside the chair in the evenings and listening to the radio, the music that Coyle had always loved, that thin and tinny stream of melody coming from the battery-powered box that was, on most evenings, the only sound in the cabin apart from the fire. There was a period, Donna Fields noticed it in her monthly visits, and wrote about it carefully in her case notes, where the three of them seemed to have reached a kind of equilibrium, a way of living with what they had and what was being lost that was not resignation and not despair, but something harder to name. Something like acceptance, but with more texture than that word usually carries. A way of being present in a life that was diminishing in some ways and completely itself in others. It was acceptance without surrender, which is a different thing entirely and rarer. Elias died in the fall of 2009. He died in his chair by the window in the early morning, before Marta came down from the sleeping loft and before Coyle woke up in the upper loft. He died looking at the gorge, which had been the view of his entire life. The trees just beginning to turn, the creek visible through the gap in the timber, the sky doing what the sky always did at the beginning of October in that particular pocket of eastern Kentucky, which was to be the exact color of something that has just finished being something else. Marta found him. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him for a long time before she moved. And then she did what she had always done. She moved. She woke Donna Fields using the mobile phone that the county had insisted on leaving with them, which neither Marta nor Elias had ever felt entirely comfortable with, and which Coyle had examined with a fascination that was one of the more amusing memories of those years. Donna Fields came. The county came. There were paperwork and procedures, the machinery of official death grinding through the gorge for the first time in the history of the family, because for the first time in the history of the family, someone from the outside world was there to set it in motion. And then they were two. The change was profound in ways that took time to fully register, even for Marta, who was by nature someone who assessed reality clearly and without sentimentality. The work had been hers for years already, so the practical dimension of the loss was not the heaviest part. The heaviest part was the silence. Elias had not spoken much. He had not needed to speak much, but his presence, the particular weight of it, the quality of a person who has been beside you so long that his absence rearranges the air, that was not replaceable and did not become less heavy with time. Coyle grieved in the way that Coyle did everything, fully and visibly, and without any protective distance between himself and the feeling. He sat in Elias's chair for days after the death, not in imitation, but in some act of proximity to what had been there. He did not eat well for weeks. He woke at night, and Marta could hear him above her moving, and she would lie in her sleeping loft and listen until the movement stopped, and she was sure he had settled. And then she would lie there awake anyway, in the silence of the gorge and the particular dark of a place with no artificial light for miles in any direction. And she would think. What she thought about, she never said entirely. She told Donna Fields some of it over the months that followed. She said she thought about the family, not the genetic reality, not the history that the doctors and the journalists and even Dr. Ashton had been interested in, but the family as she had experienced it, from the inside, which was a different thing. She thought about her parents, who were gone. She thought about the people before them, the chain of people who had lived and worked and reproduced in this gorge, and who had, generation by generation, built a world that was entirely their own, flawed, isolated, costly in ways they probably never fully understood, but theirs. She thought about what it meant to be the end of something, because she knew by then that she and Coyle were the end of it. There would be no next generation. There was nothing left to pass on except the gorge itself, the land, the cabin, the garden, the view from the window that Elias had looked at until the moment he stopped looking at anything. She thought about whether that was a tragedy or simply an ending, and she concluded that it was both and that both were true at the same time, and that this was something she could live with. She could live with it. If you have made it this far in this story, if you have stayed with Marta and Elias and Coyle through all of it, through the history and the grief and the long, quiet reality of their lives, then you already understand something about them that most of the world never took the time to understand. They were not symbols, they were not cautionary tales, they were not illustrations of policy failures or genetic disasters or the consequences of isolation. They were people. 3 people who were born into a set of circumstances they did not choose, shaped by forces they did not understand, living in a world that was both everything they had and entirely insufficient for what they needed. That is, in the end, a human story. Not a comfortable one. Not one that resolves cleanly or provides the satisfaction of a lesson fully learned, but a human one. Marta lived in the gorge until 2014, when a fall in the garden left her with a broken hip that required hospitalization, and that, at 59, with her compromised immune system and the accumulated toll of a lifetime of hard physical labor in a body that had worked twice as hard as it should have needed to, did not heal fully. She was moved, against her will and by the practical necessity of the situation, to a care facility in Pikeville, a small city about an hour from the Gorge. She lasted there for 8 months. The staff at the facility were, by all accounts, kind to her. They gave her a room with a window. They tried to accommodate her preferences. They did not know what to do with the silence she carried with her, or with the way she looked at the wall sometimes as if she were looking through it, as if the wall were a window, and on the other side of it were the gorge and the creek and the turning trees. She did not stop eating. She did not become dramatically unwell. She simply, over the course of those 8 months, became less, smaller, as if something essential was leaving her incrementally, the way water leaves a landscape in a drought. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily until one day you look and the thing that used to be there is no longer there. She died in the spring of 2015, on a morning when the facility staff noted that she had seemed more alert than usual the day before, more present, as if she had been paying attention to something. The nature of what she was paying attention to was not recorded because there was no one there who could read it. Coyle outlived her by 2 years. He was moved to a residential care facility near Lexington that specialized in adults with complex needs, and the transition was, as Marta had predicted, exactly as difficult as it should have been. He did not know where he was. He did not know what the faces meant. The staff were trained and capable and genuinely trying, but they did not know his language, the gestural, wordless, entirely precise language of the Gorge, and he did not know theirs, and the gap between those two languages was, in the end, unbridgeable. He stopped eating well. He stopped responding to the music that had always been his particular joy, which was the thing that alarmed the staff more than anything else. When the music stopped working, they understood that something fundamental had changed. He died in the winter of 2017 in his bed, on a night when a nurse had stayed with him because his breathing had changed in a way that was recognizable. She held his hand, this nurse whose name was Linda, and she said that his expression at the end was not distressed. She said it was more like the expression of someone listening for something far away, listening for something familiar, in the middle of all that was unfamiliar. The Gorge is still there. The cabin is still there, though it has begun to fall into itself in the way that structures do when no one is living in them, and maintaining them with the daily effort that is the only thing standing between a building and the ground it was built on. The garden is gone, taken back by the land that Marta had spent decades convincing to grow food. The grave plot behind the cabin has more markers now, official ones placed there by the county in a belated gesture of record-keeping that Elias and Marta would have found ironic and Coyle would not have understood. The road into the Gorge is worse than ever. The bridge is impassable. Nobody goes there now. The story of the Harlan Gorge is not a story about what should have been done differently, though it is that too. It is not a story about the failures of systems or the cruelty of isolation or the genetic consequences of consanguinity, though it is all of those things as well. It is, at its deepest level, a story about what it means to be in a family, the particular, irreducible, impossible weight of belonging to people whose faces you know better than you know anything else in the world, including yourself. Elias and Marta and Coyle were a family. They were the last of a long line. They carried in their bodies the cost of generations of turning inward, and they carried in their daily lives the only compensation that the Gorge had ever offered for that cost: each other. They had each other. In a world that mostly looked away, or looked without seeing or saw without understanding, they had each other. And in the cold and the mud and the isolation and the long quiet evenings with the radio playing music that Coyle knew by heart, and the fire burning the wood that Elias had cut, and the coffee that Marta made from nothing into something that was warm and bitter and good, in all of that, the fact that they had each other was not a small thing. It was everything. If you watched until the end, if you sat with this story all the way to where it ends in the winter of 2017 and the silence that came after, then this story did something to you. It should have. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end so I can find you," and know who really cares about the stories we tell on this channel. Your comment means more than you know. If this story moved you, press like. One tap. That is how stories like this one find the people who need them. Share this with someone who believes that every life deserves to be known, Not studied, not pitied, known. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now, because we find the stories that are buried under silence, and we tell them the way they deserve to be told, with care and without flinching. And we will keep doing it as long as you are here to listen. If you enjoy forgotten stories like this one, subscribe to the channel, because there are still many secrets waiting to be told.